I had my own kind of amateur moonshot, if you like, but I didn't have any idea what I was doing. So you kind of just point your little rocket at the moon and hope you get there. And I feel like I somehow ended up on the moon, but I didn't have a plan to return safely. So I'm just going to have to live there now.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Lindsey Stewart, who is Director of Stewardship Research and Policy at Morningstar Sustainanalytics, where he is a sustainability and governance specialist. Based in London, he writes regularly about how institutional investors engage with companies and policymakers on environmental, social, and governance themes, and is a regular speaker on these topics. He previously was head of Stakeholder Engagement at the Financial Reporting Council and spent 8 years at KPMG in various engagement roles. Welcome, Lindsey. Thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure to be here, Ethan. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start by talking a little bit about your background. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? And what did you study? And then we'll take it from there into how this ended up being an investment pursuit for you.
Sure. So I've spent my whole life in the United Kingdom. I was born just to the east of London. I grew up around Dagenham and Romford. And my parents actually came here in the 60s and 70s as part of what we call the Windrush generation of migrants from the Caribbean who came to help Britain with post-war reconstruction. But I've lived my whole life in the UK. I went to a comprehensive school, a non-selective state school in Dagenham, and I decided to start my career immediately after what they called A-levels in the UK, the exams you take at the age of 18. I decided to go into the world of finance. I had no idea how to do that, but I knew that I wanted to do it. So it was a bit like, I always liken it to John F. Kennedy's framing of the mission to go to the moon. They wanted to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. I had my own kind of amateur moonshot, if you like, but I didn't have any idea what I was doing. So you kind of just point your little rocket at the moon and hope you get there. And I feel like I somehow ended up on the moon, but I didn't have a plan to return safely. So I'm just going to have to live there now.
Well, I thought we were going with another John F. Kennedy quote, which I have on my refrigerator at home, which says, "We don't do these things because they are easy. We do them because they are hard." So
I was going to get onto that.
Well, I'm sorry.
Same speech.
We're getting there, but that's wonderful. So tell me how you did that jump, because going from school into the industry is not a well-trodden route. Perhaps we're doing more of it now. We've got more apprenticeship schemes. Tell us how you explored this moonwalk.
Well, I think it started with a bit of a disappointment due to various things that were happening in my teenage years. Like I didn't get the A-level results that I wanted. And I think I posted about that on my LinkedIn to send a message that would help other people who were going through something similar. And this was around the time when, for the first time in the UK, university education was no longer going to be supported by grants. You had to take out loans. And being from a kind of debt-averse background and a working class family, that didn't really appeal to me. Now, with hindsight, maybe it wasn't that much money and maybe I should have just done it, but we are where we are. You know, if you don't really know what you're dealing with, it affects the decisions you make. And so I just decided to try and find something resembling what we would call an apprenticeship today, to find an employer that would take me on, give me training, I would earn money and get my qualifications. And so through my career, I've picked up the Chartered Management Accountancy qualifications, the CFA qualification, and a few other financial qualifications as well while working. But no, I didn't. I ended up not going to university and going through that route. And as you say, it's a path less trodden, but I feel like in a way it has helped me going that sort of long way round, in that I've got exposure to certain things that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise had exposure to. And I have knowledge that I still call on today that still benefits me even in what I'm doing now.
And even though you could argue that a traditional university education does not actually equip you for the skills you need in finance, there would still be some skills, I suppose, taught there. How did you bridge the gap then? Were you learning on the job? I know you took these exams and you can also learn something from that. But how did you approach your own apprenticeship?
So certainly learning on the job was a big part of it. I started off in some various, what you might call back office technical roles in shareholder ID and learning the basics of how to analyze performance and valuation for investments. But I was also fortunate enough to be working for an advisory company that dealt at very senior level with listed companies. So very early on, I was learning what was on the minds of CFOs, CEOs, investor relations departments, what was important to them, what did they focus on, who were the key stakeholders, all of that knowledge surrounding the specific thing that I was doing, I was exposed to very early, and I feel like I benefited from that. But I've also been a very avid reader for as long as I can remember, just always constantly taking in information and various kinds of information, whether it's just, I don't know, picking up books and reading through history or science, or even just looking at maps and seeing where things are and what's this place over there, just constantly pulling in information. And so that certainly also helped. And I carried that through my career as well.
Well, we're going to get on to hearing what's on your reading list at the moment, because I know that's something you often share. Well, let's now just, before moving on to your current position, how did you get drawn to the field of sustainability and stewardship?
It's an interesting question. I feel like sustainability found me rather than the other way around, because I'd spent pretty much all of my career up until, say, around 2018, 2019, thinking about purely financial and strategic aspects, if we'll call it that. So things like, what's the performance of this company been? What is its valuation? What do investors think of management? What do they think of the strategy? What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? All of that sort of conventional, traditional financial thinking. And then around 2018-19, I moved into various roles that were focused on much broader aspects of investment. So what are the impacts of human capital or climate change or other such issues? And those kinds of conversations got louder and louder, particularly with the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures issuing their framework. I think that was 2017. And then there was kind of a bit of a momentum in the investment world thinking, okay, we've now got this framework for climate-related financial disclosures, but we're not getting the information from companies that we would need to make the evaluation on what kinds of risks and opportunities we're facing. So there was a huge clamor for what I would call investment grade regulations and standards that are starting to become effective now to be enacted so that investors could make those assessments. And so quite a lot of the work I was doing around investor engagement at the time started to tilt towards environmental, social, and governance topics, ESG topics. And it was hugely interesting contrasting the thinking on what's important in one area versus what's traditionally been important in finance, and trying to pick our way through how we could get to this phase where we have high quality reporting for sustainability information in a similar way to what we have for financial information.
Well, let's move on now to the nature of what you're focusing on in your role in stewardship, because I think this is a fast changing area. Can you tell us a little bit about how stewardship is evolving? Are you getting better answers now from companies, better engagement? Are they paying more attention to this function? And how has that evolved since you started working in the stewardship area?
It's certainly improving. There's a lot of focus going into working out how can you take a disclosure of a range of engagement-focused activities and proxy votes and turn that into an understandable narrative that demonstrates that you have engaged successfully on material issues to the investor and communicate to the investor that you've acted in line with the objectives that you promised them that you would follow, both on the financial side, but also increasingly on the sustainability side. Now, I don't think anyone thinks that things are perfect in that area yet, but they're certainly improving. And we've seen voluntary codes like the FRC Stewardship Code that I did a lot of work on engaging with investors to determine what was working and what needed to improve. Those kinds of voluntary disclosures are increasingly seen as best practice in the industry. And so we're getting better information than we ever have in that area. But there's certainly a long road to go in terms of determining what activity really does make a difference and communicating that more effectively.
And I know that there have been some high profile cases, especially in the ESG area, where corporates have pushed back on some of the demands of activist investors, maybe also of engagers. And this has been seen to be perhaps an inefficient use of their time. Are you experiencing any of that pushback? You mentioned that we're not where we want to be yet. How is stewardship at its most effective?
Yeah, I think there's been a bit of push and pull between investors and other actors with very high intentions on sustainability and those who are in a much more conventional mindset thinking very strictly, what is the financial materiality of this? This may be a good thing for the world, but what it is good for investors. And there's a pendulum that swings backwards and forwards between the level of intention on sort of sustainability and that conventional thinking. And I think we reached a high point on the sustainability focused thinking, perhaps around 2020, 2021, We heard, the words climate risk is investment risk was shouted very prominently by certain asset managers. We had COP26 in Glasgow, where the finance sector was seen as central to driving climate transition and other social goods. I think we've moved away from that idea a bit. I think there's a lot more consideration for the fact that certain things are not within the purview of investors to make societal changes and probably should not be. There are reasons why we have democratically elected governments to deal with that side of things. And so I think as part of that conversation, there is a bit of tension between those who have particularly high sustainability intentions and those with those more conventional views. And I think that pendulum will swing backwards and forwards over time.
And talk us through some of the topics you're covering in your newsletter, which you call Stewardship Snapshots, because obviously that's keeping us up to date on some of what you're seeing in day to day.
Yeah, so right now, I'd say I'm in my other proxy season. So I guess you normally have a proxy voting season in the spring in the Northern Hemisphere, March, April, May, June, where investors get to vote on the majority of company shareholder meetings. But now, coming towards the autumn, we start to see how a lot of those investors have voted, because most of them report only once a year for the previous year. And so there's a lot of analysis that we've already started doing in August on what the overall market trends are when it comes to voting on environmental and social issues versus governance issues. And we're starting to look into individual managers' voting records. And as we just discussed, it's clear that the level of intention when it comes to enacting sustainability-focused policies, that does seem to have dropped market-wide. There are still a lot of very sustainability conscious asset managers and asset owners who are demanding strong climate action. They're not necessarily the largest investor in the market. And so we're continuing to see a dialogue happening between those two sides in particular on what is the best way to move forward. Increasingly, we're seeing asset managers move towards multi-track engagement models where decarbonization focused or sustainability focused stewardship would be there for those who explicitly say they want it, whereas a more conventional approach would be taken for all other portfolios. And it will be interesting to see where that gets us in terms of what is possible for action on sustainability in investment.
And let's move to the reliability of data, because you've talked about your involvement with data since early in your career. And there is some, I suppose, question mark about how robust some of the sustainability data we are currently receiving is. What grade would you give it in terms of its robustness, and how has that improved over time?
I'd say it was improving, but still immature. I think even to this day, despite the fact that we do have some emergent standards and regulations for sustainability reporting, there's nothing equivalent yet to generally accepted accounting principles for sustainability in terms of what you need to report, how you decide what is material, how frequently you can report on things or should report on things, and what happens if you need to make a change. It's important to remember that even GAAP had to be invented. There probably was a time around a half a century ago when we had a conversation about whether we should get companies to report their revenues, their profits, their financial position according to accounting standards. I'm sure there were some voices that said, well, surely the companies don't know best. We should trust them to report what they need to report. But we moved away from that. And now nobody would dare make the argument that GAAP is not useful. There's a conversation still being had about whether certain sustainability reporting standards are necessary. What is the materiality level that should be applied when reporting? What is the liability if a company gets something wrong and needs to make a restatement? We're having all of those conversations that we once had with accounting are now happening with sustainability focused financial reporting. So it will be interesting to see where we end up. We're still in a bit of a fragmented state, and that's not helpful for getting globally consistent and robust data. Hopefully that will converge over the next few years. But we're on the clock here. We all know what the problems are in the world when it comes to the environmental and social issues that we're facing. So hopefully we can get to a good place on that pretty quickly.
And you've been named as an ESG influencer. So congratulations on that esteemed title. What would you say you're hoping to influence?
Well, when you look at ESG, I think it's a phrase that in that 2018, 19, 20 phase that we talked about, it was useful for identifying that there was a universe of topics out there that the financial world isn't really paying enough attention to. Now that's all on the agenda. We've still got this ESG label, as it were, that isn't quite so useful for identifying which specific topics you're focusing on and why and how to address them. And importantly, what the trade-offs are. What do you have to give up to get what you want in sustainability? or what new problem is being caused by your solution, because you can safely assume in this area that every solution you implement will be the cause of a new problem. And I don't think that's spoken about enough. So what my goal is in terms of influencing people is really digging through the data, digging through voting policies, through emerging sustainability reporting standards, basically all the things that nobody has the time or the will to read, and pick out information and then present it and explain it in a way that will allow an investor to make a better quality decision. Not necessarily a decision that I will agree with or that someone else will agree with, but one that is well informed, it is based on evidence, it is not tainted by misinformation, and there's plenty of that out there. Just enabling investors to make a better quality decision, to empower investor success, as we might say at Morningstar.
That's fascinating, because certainly what you mentioned, like one action having another chain reaction almost, is sort of would suggest a systems thinking approach is much more important than single issue focuses. And I'm also thinking with this sheer amount of data, which is only growing, that you have to sift through and distill so that those better decisions can be made. How much can you recruit AI to help with some of that?
It's an interesting question. I think AI certainly has a role in scaling up the analysis that needs to be done to get better quality answers on sustainability and in finance generally. However, there are a few areas in which I have some, not necessarily reservations, but some questions. For example, I think going back to my early performance and valuation analysis days, I was involved in building systems that could very quickly construct charts and pull out data in a very rudimentary way, nothing as advanced as we have today. But when training other people to do it, I never let them use those tools until they could demonstrate they could do it from first principles. So the principle there is that the person, a human, has to always know what's going on. And so I think from that perspective, and I'm sure an expert may well disagree with me and tell me why I'm wrong, and I'd welcome that. But from my perspective, AI will be massively useful in scaling up processes that we understand to be well governed, that are well documented, and that humans already know how to do. So instead of having to recruit 100 other humans, you can now put an AI onto this. Where I think it might even be dangerous is where you have a poorly defined process that barely anyone understands, that isn't well documented. You send an AI out to get you an answer, and AI gets you an answer, but you can't necessarily explain how it got that answer, what its sources are, or what is the relative value of each piece of information that's drawn into it. If a human can't explain all those things, this is how you can quickly end up in trouble. And so that's why I think it needs to be entered into with a degree of caution, but also some optimism on the sheer capability that it brings to bear.
And now we'll move back to one of my favorite topics, books. And you often post book lists or book recommendations. Can you tell us what's currently on your list or the proverbial bedside table in terms of reading recommendations?
Before I get to that, I'm going to mention a Japanese word that I picked up called sundoku. It's when you accumulate books that you never quite get around to finishing. And I'm in that phase of my life at the moment. But I think there are a few books that I've certainly made a good headway into reading. I think May Contain Lies by Alex Edmonds is brilliant. Higher Ground by Alison Taylor. Right Kind of Wrong by Amy Edmondson. These are all the kinds of books that plug into the thinking that I've just explained, helping people make higher quality decisions, not fall into logical fallacies, not be susceptible to misinformation, and allowing themselves to make decisions without necessarily having all the facts, but making the best decision they can make with the facts that they have.
Fascinating. I'll put links to those books in the show notes. So this podcast, as you know, we have a focus on diversity and inclusion within the investment industry. And given that is generally under the ESG umbrella, and you're an influencer in this respect, what would you say your impressions of diversity and inclusion in the industry are today? And have they changed over time?
Diversity and inclusion is an ever evolving area. And I think for what is a highly conservative industry in financial services, it is incredible to see how far we've come since I started my career almost 25 years ago in thinking about the various topics that go into diversity and inclusion: gender, ethnicity, sexuality, neurodiversity, socio-economic inclusion. But if I had to give it a grade, I'd still give it a C+ or a B-, depending on what's happened that day or how generous I'm feeling. There's still a long way to go. I think there's a lot of earnest effort being put into improving access to the profession and training people and retaining people within it, particularly those that do not come from what we would call the more traditional backgrounds that end up in finance. But there's still definitely a long way to go. In terms of causes that I'm amplifying currently, I chair a UK working group for the CFA Institute's DEI code, and that's been an interesting year and a bit of work for me and a committed group of volunteers, where we took on an existing code that the CFA Institute had implemented in North America and tried to adapt it for UK use. There are certain things in the space of diversity and inclusion in the United States that are well-intentioned but not necessarily applicable here, and vice versa. There are things that we do here in the UK that are not really such an issue in the US. And so we went through various intersections, as the jargon goes, thinking about all of those things: race, ethnicity, gender, neurodiversity, social mobility, LGBTQ plus issues, even things like returning parents, things that are not necessarily obviously thought of as inclusion issues, but they're certainly out there, and tried to make a usable standard-like code that the investment industry could use. And so we're quite proud of the work we've done with that. I think intersectionality is key. It gets a bit of a bad rap sometimes because it's such a long word, as I've heard from some people, but I think it is absolutely fundamental to understanding inclusion when added to diversity, is thinking that nobody is just one of these things at one time. They're all of those things every single day, every single minute. And there is a need to consider the way that that is handled within the workplace and outside of it. So if anyone thinks of a shorter word that we can use, I'm open to it. But yeah, I do very much advocate for that.
Wonderful. I like that you called out the earnest efforts being made, because I think that word is key. They are earnest. They are well-intentioned. They don't always achieve everything they set out to achieve. But I think the important thing is not to discourage these efforts and to encourage and celebrate them, and ultimately recognize that causal links and causation may take a while to prove. I'd love to move on to some personal reflections now. So you've had an interesting start to your career, as you mentioned, not a conventional one. Were there any setbacks or challenges or any particular mistakes made over the course of your career so far that you learned lessons from?
Keeping it quite general, I think some of the biggest setbacks that I've overcome have come from learning to understand myself better than I used to, understanding the things that I struggle with, or for example, perfectionism or overcoming anxiety in certain situations, focusing on what's important rather than trying to deal with everything at once, prioritizing, that kind of thing has been really, really useful to me. And I've done a bit of studying around that area, sort of on the personal side and also the formal study side, looking at things like psychology and neurodiversity and other issues. I think understanding myself has pulled me out of some of the times where I've completely burned myself out working on a project and focusing on that over everything else, or where I've not necessarily had the understanding of somebody's position that I would have had if I could have leaned in towards more empathy or a better understanding of how perspectives can differ. So I think that kind of knowledge has been very, very important to me throughout my later career.
And how about any key people who were mentors to you or sponsors or inspirational to you along that journey?
Oh, too many of those to mention. I think there's just been a long line of senior people who have given me time and attention when that was not an obvious thing to do. Starting way back in 2000 at my first business, Makinson Cowell, and then at KPMG, at the FRC, and at Morningstar, and people throughout the industry that have demonstrated a willingness to help where I have shown genuine interest in what they're doing. I'd also say there's a massive emphasis on having the role model, the figurehead, that person who's just kind of a feature in your life for years that you talk with regularly. But I think there's also opportunities to just learn from people in small ways and even from a distance, just observe people, see what they do well and try to incorporate that into your own repertoire. And that's something I've often tried to do as well. Find out what certain people are good at, or even find out how another person's experience, even if they're from a very, very different background to you, may be similar to your own, and then learning from the way that they've overcome their challenges has been very, very helpful.
Well, thank you for plugging a lot of the work we do here, which is, of course, sharing experiences in the hope of these narratives reinforcing resilience in others. Looking at pieces of advice, often these nuggets that we get from others are in the forms of a creed or a motto that that person lives by, or a piece of advice that they've given you. Is there any such advice that you can share here, or any creed or motto that you live by?
Oh, nothing particularly deep, but In terms of becoming, a senior research professional, but who also did quite a lot of work on editing and communications, there's something we talk about called the curse of knowledge. Once you know something, it's very difficult to act as though you don't know it. And that just because something is obvious to you, it's not necessarily obvious. And so investing time in explaining your position, backing it up with evidence, stating your assumptions, going through the whole process each time and not just rattling out your conclusions has led to better conversations for me and led me to reach higher quality conclusions, not necessarily skipping through the process and coming up with a fallacious answer. So I think that's the advice I have.
Any last word of wisdom for that young boy in school in Dagenham? Anything that you know now that you wish you had known then?
What I wish I'd known is that everything is going to be fine. And so I would have spent a lot less time worrying, but also just to take your time, enjoy the journey, celebrate your small achievements along the way, because I feel like I didn't do enough of that, even at times when objectively I had done well. I try to do it more now, but I didn't give myself that space before. So I think I would also advise myself to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsey. I was drawn to you through reading some of your LinkedIn writing that you put up there. I see it as kind of a letter to the industry. It is literally a newsletter, but it comes across as an easy to understand translation of some of the complexity. And I'd say it's actually a growing complexity of the field that you work in. And unfortunately, as it grows in complexity, and you mentioned the curse of knowledge, it becomes less and less accessible to the largest cohort, whether it be financial professionals or otherwise. And I wanted to thank you for breaking down that wall and continuing to make this accessible and translatable for us. So thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. You've been really, really grateful to hear that. I'll keep writing for as long as it's useful to people.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find all of our content on the 50 Faces Hub, where you'll find a library of role models, resources, and other solutions to enhance your career. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.